I am known for speaking too much. Um, this is going to be different because I'm also known not to speak about myself, my personal experiences. So my name is Sipho. I'm a counseling psychologist. I am not using that degree at the moment for what it was meant for. I'm a PhD candidate at Unisa, MRC. So I'm going to talk about somewhere over there. I'm going to talk about clinical supervision as disciplining. And sorry, I just need to find these notes. Okay, so I'm going to talk about clinical supervision as disciplining, the idea of a good enough student psychologist. So for those of you who are in psychology will know the three sort of registration categories when you start off. The first one is the student psychologist, and that's during your M1 year. Really 10 months, but can be quite defining for a lot of us and a lot of people who leave psychology the moment they walk into that M1 class. And for me, in particular, I stayed because of M1, even though I didn't quite enjoy psychology when I got to that level. Okay, so I chose that year, like I said, for a variety of reasons, but mostly it's because it's shaped how I think of psychology, how I think of even the role of a supervisor, what it means to be a student, and for me, what it means to be a psychologist in this country. So on the outset, somebody said this to me yesterday, that my presentation made them sad. So I hope it doesn't make you sad, but it sort of illuminates a couple of things that can be useful for supervisors, can be useful for potential students of psychology. So it is also important for me to note that this is entirely my experiences, so it might not be the same for the other black students that were in that class with me. They might have experienced these particular supervisors differently, and they might have experienced the M1 year differently also. And also, secondly, that I am really grateful, because I'm sure they're going to see this on the internet, to those people who were involved in my training, because good or bad, it actually got me to this point. Okay, so I did my training at a liberal, historically white university, which shall remain unnamed. I think what was important for me coming into that program was that I wasn't accepted outright into the program. I was waitlisted. And then subsequently, a couple of months later, actually it was almost exactly a month later, I got a phone call saying, hey, there's a spot, do you want to take it up? I'd met quite a number of the candidates who were interviewed there, so I knew who was the person who got out of the program and I got in. And it was another black man. And that became significant for me in how I viewed how and why I got into the program. It began questions about belonging. It began questions about, could you never have more than one black man in that program? And I mean, giving them the benefit of the doubt, I know the previous year they did have more than one black man, but it's always interesting to sort of think about why change, why are you changing, and all of that stuff. So I mean, also giving the institution benefit of the doubt, I did start thinking maybe they had to balance out the gender and race ratios, but there's always an imbalance, because my PhD is actually on the training of psychologists, so I know a bit about this. There's always an imbalance where you have more white women in almost every institution, whether it's an institution like UWC or whether it's an institution like UCT, for example, which is not where I went, by the way. Just to be clear. But there's always an imbalance where you have more white women than you have any other gender or racial, which is an interesting thing for me, particularly in my own research. Okay, so I guess most of us have heard of the term, the imposter syndrome. This is something that you hear often. I hear it across races, across genders, where people are like, I just had the imposter syndrome and all of that. Sometimes I do feel, and apologies to all the white colleagues, I do feel that it's disingenuous with white people when they say it, because psychology in particular has something to do with whiteness, where they just seem like they are more comfortable in there. And I'll elucidate, I guess, part of this. Maybe I should say it now, because at that particular university, all my supervisors, all my lecturers were white, all of them. I had not one single black lecturer or supervisor. Actually, that's wrong. I had one lecturer for exactly 3 hours who did heteronormativity and multiculturalism. She was the only person. So that on its own was a contested issue amongst my very radical classmates. My classmates did not accept things at face value. So I mean, the imposter syndrome for me was the feeling of being the odd one out, even though I was one of 2 black males in the program. But our experiences, of course, were different, coming from different places. I had moved to a different province, which made it even more difficult for me. So I did feel like I was out of place, that I shouldn't have been here. And of course, it was related to how I got into the program again. So you always have these things running in your head all the time. So I did feel a lot like I was going to get caught out, that I would wake up one day and somebody would be like, oh, sorry, Sipho, actually, we wanted Mark, not you. Sorry, like there was a typo somewhere. Even though I got a phone call from the program coordinator, there was still always that sort of thing. Okay, so most of my classmates, like I said, did say that they did feel this imposter syndrome, but for me it seemed to last longer, and it seemed to become more pronounced at particular stages. And I'll highlight just 2 of these things that happened. This was during this clinical supervision. So one of the first supervisions that we did was essentially, for me, now reflecting on it, I think about, most of my colleagues at ISHS know this, I have just this huge love of the Afrikaner philosopher Lewis Gordon now, and particularly because he has this way of just encapsulating black experiences almost on a global scale. He says this thing about how particular disciplines sort of fetishize methods and methods of practice as being godlike or being descendant from God, that this is how you do things, and this is where the disciplining comes. This is how you act, this is how you do things, and most importantly for me, which was a huge challenge, this is how you think of the world, which is a particular sort of thing. Okay. So the first example, it was during, we had group therapy, group supervision. We never really had individual supervision for clinical supervision, we had group supervision. So during this one, particularly early on, should have been our 3rd or 4th one, the supervisor said, you are being flippant with your clients. Now this for me was quite jarring because first of all, I had no idea what flippant meant. It just sounded bad. I was like, what are you saying? So of course I asked, what do you mean? And the explanation that was given to me was that it seemed as though I don't care. Now this is a huge thing, because as a psychologist, the one thing that you think you have that nobody can train you to do is to care about the people you are working with. So there was this thing, again, about my capacity to care about people, and I knew at the outset that nobody can train me to care. I mean, psychology writes texts about empathy, which is always strange for me. It's like trying to teach people empathy. It's a strange thing to say. But it was very difficult for me because it, again, was happening at a time when you are feeling like I do not belong here. I'm not supposed to be here. Right? So again, it had to do about how I express emotions, which was particularly interesting, sort of trying to review that. And now, upon reflection, it's always this thing of there's an expectation. It's not just an expectation of how you think. It's an expectation of how you express emotion. That surprise looks in a particular way. That sadness looks in a particular way, empathy for a client's situation looks in a particular way. But also at the same time, because that institution is big on both the two CBT and psychodynamic theory, where psychodynamic theory is very wary about your investment in the client's worldview and then your inability to see this objectiveness. All right, thank you. I'll go quickly. So I'll just sort of skip on to the second example because I think it fits in. The second one had to do with writing. I mean, I've always been involved in debating, public speaking, writing essays. I've even wrote some essays for people when I was in high school. Don't tell anybody. So when I wrote my first psychology report, I was expecting that I was going to be told, no, you have to use this technical language. Of course, psychology has its own language. The first thing at the top of that, and till this day, it's been over 2 years, 3 years now, since I saw that report, the first thing was, this is not how you write. And that's jarring because it's saying there's something wrong with you. What are you doing? This is not how we do things. And again, it's important because this was coming from a white person. So there's always that thing, and I know a lot of people try to avoid it, but race always is always involved somehow, that who gets to speak and who gets to decide who writes how and who says what in what way. So there were always those sort of things. So then it wasn't only I didn't have the emotional capacity to care about my clients, but now I also can't do the most basic thing, which is write. So there were always those things that always sort of live in your head where you're always asking yourself, do I belong here? And just to sort of add on, I was lucky because I guess I was fortunate in that sense. I was at that university at a particular moment. I was at that university, 2015, everybody knows what was happening then. But I also stayed in res, and I stayed with quite a number of different sort of black people who were thinking about these things, who would tell you, no, my supervisor just told me, why are you doing your masters? You should just quit, stop now. And people would just take naps and wake up, and we just, these kinds of support systems that are outside of the supervision thing, that you almost, when you go back to clinical supervision, you're like, okay, I know what I'm expecting. You're always expecting the negative from your supervisor, which is not a particularly good way to live through that master's year, which is difficult enough. And also related to that, I think it's the issue of life experiences, and I was hoping that somebody was going to speak about that. One of the supervisors could give us an idea of when you're applying for your master's, everybody's like, you need to have life experience, but nobody can really tell you what that is. But upon reflecting on that moment, reflecting on that time, and reflecting on psychology in general, just trying to do my PhD, is that my particular life experiences seem to be privileged only upon application. But when I'm in the program, I need to fit into this box, right, into this discipline, that there's a particular kind of life experience that is actually needed of you. And at times would discuss just different universities and what they're looking for. One university application was like, have you traveled? Like, have I? I lived in 3 different provinces. I'm not sure. But it's a particular kind of traveling, right? Have you on multiple contradictions? It's very introspective, but people within it most of the time don't think about what they are saying and how they are saying it. So the supervisor might have been pointing out something very important about how I present myself towards clients, but the manner that it was delivered was telling me that there was something wrong with me rather than I needed to improve a particular thing. So it's always for me, I guess, for both students and for both supervisors, because I did the master's training because clearly I needed to be trained to be a psychologist. So I wasn't a perfect human being, right? But there's also this thing of how do you address this person and how do you reach across, particularly when you need to be aware. And I said it was a liberal university because I think most of these things happen in liberal universities because people think, oh, I get it, right? They write about this thing all the time, they give talks, and they think, oh yeah, no, I get this. I understand what people, But actually, when you don't ask the question, you don't get to really fully understand. Okay? Anyway, I think I'm done. I mean, just to say about that university, again, because they're going to see this on the internet, that, I mean, there were times, and of course, the supervisor, we spoke towards the end of the year, middle of the year, about that thing, and I was able to tell her that this thing has bothered me for this long, you know, and hopefully that particular supervisor, even both of them, have sort of reflected and tried to change all of that stuff. Right. Thank you.